Afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the third webinar in our eBiz Sneak Peek series. This is Digital Transformation with Innovation and Technology Strategist Jack Shaw. Jack has over 30 years experience helping leaders transform their organization's digital ecosystems amid new waves of technology. With this knowledge, he has helped industry leaders understand how such emerging technologies such as AI, blockchain, IoT, and other things will impact their digital ecosystem, and how these technologies are practiced and applied both today and tomorrow. If you have any questions or comments during the presentation, you can type them into the Q&A and we will be answering them at the end. There will be a brief survey at the completion of the webinar, and we'd appreciate it if everyone would complete that for us to get your feedback. And with that, I will give Jack the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Eliana, and welcome everybody. As you can probably imagine, being an innovation and technology strategist, I'm often asked to talk about the future. And whenever I am, I always try to keep in mind the words of that great American philosopher, Yogi Berra, who put it so well when he said that making predictions is very hard, especially about the future. Nevertheless, I'm going to go out on a limb today and make a few predictions. And I'm going to start by asking you to join me on a short trip to the near future. The latest generation of passenger jet pauses for a moment at the end of the runway at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris before being cleared for takeoff on a non-stop transoceanic flight to Dulles International Airport in Washington. Several hours later, far out over the North Atlantic, a sensor embedded in its electrical systems determines that a critical electrical component is beginning to behave erratically. It's not an immediate emergency, but for safety purposes, the component will have to be replaced on arrival at Dulles before the aircraft can return back to Paris. And the problem that this poses is that it's a very expensive part, and it's one that rarely, if ever, needs to be replaced between scheduled maintenance. So it's not a part that they keep on inventory at Dulles. Now, what does this mean? Back in the old days, like say 2020, this would have meant taking the aircraft out of service for many hours, maybe a day or more, while the part was located, ordered, delivered to Dulles and replaced, at tremendous expense to the airline and great inconvenience for passengers also. But no longer. Instead, what happens is that the airline's procurement system launches an intelligent procurement agent onto the internet. It checks the IDEA connector database for current and prospective new suppliers of this part certified for use in this particular aircraft, and identifies a number of those suppliers who can provide the part and can guarantee delivery of that part to Dulles before the aircraft arrives a few hours from now. It negotiates prices, terms, and conditions with each of those suppliers and selects one of those suppliers with whom to place the order, and negotiates a legally enforceable online smart contract for the purchase of that electrical component from that supplier. On completion of execution of that contract, the supplier has the part picked and arranges for immediate delivery of that part to Dulles. The entire time that has been taken since the Internet of Things sensor embedded in the aircraft's electrical system noticed the erratic behavior on the part of this critical component, and the component has been picked and scheduled for delivery to Dulles, is a grand total of 4 minutes with no human intervention required in the process at all. A few hours later, the aircraft arrives at Dulles, and the part is replaced while the aircraft is being serviced, having arrived at the gate about an hour before the aircraft pulls in. And the aircraft subsequently leaves on time, without a minute's delay, with a new key electrical component installed and working properly to ensure many more safe and reliable international round trips. So the question I've got to ask is, how closely does this represent the way that your company, and your clients manage major equipment maintenance and parts replacement today? My guess is not too many of you are doing these things. But with tools like IDEA Connector and other emerging tools and technologies, this is the way the world is moving very quickly. And this is something that you're going to need to be able to be ready to participate in. This is all part of an emerging set of tools and technologies tremendously impacting manufacturers and distributors, not only in the electrical industry, but all industries. Everything from autonomous robotics to big data, augmented reality, additive manufacturing or 3D printing, Internet of Things and so forth, are bringing about tremendous change in our organizations. One of the things that will be impacting us perhaps most significantly is AI. And AI is not something that you suddenly throw a switch and everything is different. It really represents a continuum as we evolve from data analytics, aspects of data analytics, descriptive analytics, what happened, what sometimes is referred to as business intelligence, and has been around really in many forms for 30 years or more now. And that in turn morphs into predictive analytics based on what has happened so far, what's likely to happen in the near future. For example, predictive analytics is being used to identify that a part based on signals coming out of it is not behaving the way we expected, and at some point in the near future is going to stop behaving correctly, therefore needs to be replaced. And ultimately, as we move closer to what we think of as AI, prescriptive analytics, what needs to be done? What do we need to do in order to fix this problem? In this case, we need to have the replacement part on hand at the airport by the time the aircraft gets there. And these are just examples of the ways that AI is going to be impacting manufacturers and distributors. Everything from production scheduling to monitoring machine performance, to assigning the right repair technician to the right job, to communicating with customers when exactly parts or orders will be delivered, even to predicting product line sales trends that haven't yet been recognized by people, but adjusting you toward making more or distributing more of what will be selling in the near future. One of the key technologies that's coming into play is blockchain technology. We're not going to take the time today to get into the details of blockchain, how blockchain works. All I will say that is I hope you are well aware by now that blockchain is much more than just Bitcoin and digital currencies. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. Increasingly across business and industry, supply chain ecosystems of the traditional type are changing. When we used to look at supply chain ecosystems, manufacturers, transportation, distribution, retailers, end customers, as the case might be, what we saw was a series of siloed databases of information. Each had their own view of what the supply chain looked like. And information was exchanged stepwise, one tier at a time, going up and down that supply chain. So that we never had true synchronization of the view of the supply chain across all the participants in the supply chain. Sometimes those exchanges of information, even if they're taking place electronically these days, as opposed to the paper-based information exchanges that typically took place 20, 30 years ago and more, and unfortunately, not all even are, but even where they are not necessarily done immediately. And they're not always done exactly correctly. And therefore, that means decisions have to be made by ecosystem participants at various places in the supply chain that are based on late, inaccurate, or even completely missing information. With blockchain, it's a different scenario because now what you've got is all of the participants in the supply chain able to simultaneously access a common data pool of securely shared information. Now, not everybody can see everything. For example, a customer does not want competing distributors or retailers or manufacturers to see the prices quoted by their competition. But everybody is able to see everything that they're authorized to see and update everything they're authorized to update in real time. And as soon as anybody updates anything, everyone is able, who is authorized to see that information, is able to see it immediately. Therefore, we eliminate many of the delays, errors, and missing information on which businesses need to be able to make decisions. One of the key components of blockchain technology is the ability to have what are called smart contracts. Now, smart contracts are computer programs that can run on a blockchain but have all the functionality of a legal contract in that they can take custody over assets on the blockchain, such as funds set aside in escrow in anticipation of successful execution of a contract. And they can track what has happened to date in terms of information and events. And they, based on that, can take actions and make decisions triggering additional information and events to be made available to the appropriate individuals, entities working in that supply chain. One of the other things that is being done with blockchain-enabled supply chains is tracking provenance of products, parts, materials of all different types. For example, you may recall that a couple of years ago, most of the romaine lettuce in the country, in the United States at least, had to be recalled because there was E. coli contamination. And what was found, Walmart was working on a project with IBM at the time, and they had determined that for them to trace back, using even the best electronic-based systems available at the time, stepwise through their entire supply chain to find out where did the contaminated romaine originate from, looking back several tiers of their supply chain. And then looking forward from there, where did all that contaminated romaine, or the romaine from the contaminated source, end up, was taking them nearly a week, over 6 days, to find this information. Well, obviously they can't take a week to decide whether or not to keep the romaine that's on the shelves at retail stores, so they had to throw it all away, tens of millions of dollars worth of loss. But with blockchain-based technology in place, they were able to immediately look at the status and history of all of the movement of product up and down the supply chain and reduce the time to track the romaine to its source and back from almost a week to 2 seconds. Think about the impact of that. And think about the impact of tracking provenance if you're in the electrical industry, especially if you have electronic parts with that may include circuitry that relies on coltan and other rare earths for its manufacture. Do you suddenly want to find out that you've got Greenpeace picketing your company because you're selling products, parts of which have originated hiring child slave labor in warlord areas of the world that are controlling some of the mining of some of these rare earths and key components that are used in electronic parts? Well, obviously nobody wants to see that. And now by being able to track the provenance of parts, materials, and products of various types, blockchain technology can provide tremendous more value and control up and down the supply chain. So between blockchain, AI, Internet of Things, and a range of other tools and technologies, tremendous changes are going to be taking place in manufacturing and distribution in the years to come. But none of this matters unless you have a broader, innovative planning process for anticipating and managing strategic disruptions in your business. And what do we mean by strategic disruptions? Well, pandemics, obviously, we're all well aware of the impact of the COVID pandemic. But think about climate change at the same time. And that's already starting to have huge impacts. The forest fires that we're having in the West, the increased number of hurricanes, rising sea levels, changes in temperatures and its impact on agriculture around the world, for example. And unfortunately, unlike with any particular pandemic, we're not going to come up with a vaccine that gets made and widely distributed within a year or two that solves the problem of climate change. It's going to require strategic planning. Geopolitical disruptions, everything from impulsive trade tariffs that are imposed by politicians looking for short-term political gain in their various countries, to local and even regional wars of various types, can have a huge impact on business. And emerging technologies themselves. Think about the impact that social media has had on business and society over the last 5 to 10 years, but also tools like AI, blockchain, Internet of Things, 3D printing are all going to be profoundly changing many businesses and industries in varying ways. And we need to plan for those impacts at the same time. Now, when it comes to the pandemic, in the short term, businesses have appropriately been focused on taking care of their people, their employees, their customers, their suppliers, and by taking all recommended precautions and steps, albeit with far too many exceptions, unfortunately, most people will avoid getting COVID-19. But very few businesses will avoid the economic impact of COVID-19. And in order to address that, it means that businesses have to look at what is your response going to be or going to continue to be now for the next 30, 60, 90 days? Do you need more loans? Do you need to make more furloughs or layoffs? Are you going to be able to restart? How are you going to manage that process? You're going to have to set up flexible systems to execute those responses, and you're going to have to continuously monitor the situation. But that's just the near term. How do you plan for these uncertainties in the long term? Some people have begun to say that, well, long-term strategic planning is dead. You just can't do it anymore, because what's the point of having a strategic plan if something like COVID or climate change or geopolitical, like imposition of tariffs on steel and aluminum, is going to totally disrupt our supply chain in our particular industry? We just can't do strategic planning. All we can do is plan out for the next 60 to 90 days. Well, the military has been dealing with these kinds of issues for centuries. There's a famous old saying in the military that the first casualty of war is the plan. And that's absolutely true. From a business perspective, if you think of planning as traditional strategic planning, where once a year during the fourth quarter, we sit down with a few key people for a couple of weeks, we go through a strategic planning exercise, which basically ends up being tinkering around the edges of a few of the things we're doing in the business. We make some minor operational changes and then proceed into the next year, basically with business as usual, until suddenly something comes along like the pandemic and our entire apple cart is upset with it. But there's a better way to do this, and it's called dynamic transformational planning. We've all heard the old saying, think globally, act locally. And you still need to do that, especially in today's global society and global economy. But with dynamic transformational planning, you also think long-term while acting in the short term. So how does this work? Well, you start by identifying high-level strategic goals needed to execute your overall plan. How can you leverage your company's core competencies, resources, and capabilities to meet the changing needs of the market and to address both current and potential strategic threats and disruptions? Now, in order to achieve any goal, you have to have a plan. And you can certainly have more than one plan for achieving a goal. Let me share a simple example with you here. Imagine that your goal is to drive home from work. Now, it's for those of you that actually are still driving to work these days during the pandemic. But if your goal is to drive home from work, one plan could be to take the expressway, whereas plan B might be take surface streets. Now, each of these plans has advantages and disadvantages, and you could choose to switch plans partway through. For example, if there's an accident on the expressway, you could switch to the take surface streets plan. Now, in order to be able to execute a plan, you need to have achieved sub-goals. Those goals relate to having the resources and capabilities needed to properly execute that plan. And to achieve those sub-goals, providing the resources and capabilities necessary to execute the high-level plans, you have to be able to achieve lower-level plans, and so forth. Now, this sounds quite complicated if you're simply discussing it verbally. But if you look at it diagrammatically, it's actually pretty straightforward. There's a tool called a plan goal graph. Let me show you how that works. You have an overall plan, and to execute your overall plan, your highest level plan of business, you have to achieve a series of goals, which means that you have all the necessary resources and capabilities necessary to execute your high-level business plan. Now, each of those goals, in turn, may have one or more subplans. Here we see 3 different subplans, any one or a combination of which might be used to achieve goal number 2. And in the case of goal number 5, we've identified 4 different potential subplans. And taking it down to the next level, here we see various sub-goals that would need to be achieved in order to execute sub-plan 2B. And similarly, various sub-goals that would need to be achieved in order to execute sub-plan 5D. Now let's take a look at how this could look in a real business. If you've got your overall dynamic transformation plan, it's going to incorporate such high-level goals as having the appropriately trained and capable workforce, having whatever kinds of physical facilities your business needs to have, having appropriate information technologies and other technologies in place, having revenues necessary to sustain your business, and ensuring that you've addressed strategic disruptions of various types. Now, in the example of having revenues, you might have a plan which is a product sales plan. We're going to sell products. Okay. In order to execute a product sales plan effectively, among other things, you would need to have products, you would need to market and sell those products, and you would need to be able to fulfill orders. And if you're going to have a product, that means you either need to buy it, for example, if you're a distributor purchasing from a manufacturer, or as a manufacturer, you would need to be able to make that product. Similarly, you could fulfill orders by direct shipping or shipping from warehouses, or a combination of those 2 plans. If you choose to make products, that means you need to have parts and you need to assemble the product. And if you're going to have parts, you either need to buy the parts from upper tier suppliers, or you need to make the parts yourself. Well, you can see how this process can be structured, and you can break it down in more detail until you get down to the actual executional operations of your business in all of the parts of your business. Now, as far as having technology is concerned, if you're going to execute an overall strategic technology plan, some of the things you're going to need to do are to optimize your existing legacy infrastructure, your legacy technology, but you're also going to need to have strategies in place for such things as artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, blockchain, and perhaps other key emerging technologies. If you're in manufacturing, for example, you'll probably need to have a strategy in place for 3D printing. If you're going to optimize your legacy technology, the plan to do so could be driven purely on an IT cost effectiveness basis, but you could also have a plan for business process impact in terms of leveraging your legacy technologies to enhance your existing business processes. For emerging technologies like AI and the others, you could have them strictly focus on business process, such as robotic process automation of key business processes, but they could also look more broadly at your overall business model, or even the entire impact on your ecosystem, such as the example that I talked about at the beginning of this presentation with the AIs of both the airlines and its suppliers interacting with one another to negotiate the procurement of critical parts on a timely basis. Similarly, for Internet of Things technologies, it could be a business-driven, process-driven plan, a business model-driven plan within your own enterprise, or a broader ecosystem-driven plan. Now, blockchain is often referred to as a team sport because in most cases it doesn't make sense to do blockchain unless you're doing it with your key trading partners in your supply chain or overall business ecosystem. So typically that's going to be an ecosystem impact-driven plan. But if you're a large, sophisticated, complex, and geographically decentralized business, it may be that you utilize blockchain simply within the four walls of your own broad enterprise to enhance the way your business model functions, even if you're not actively also using it for driving your ecosystem. Or I should say, using ecosystem-driven plans to make it. Now, looking at strategic disruptions. How do you plan for strategic disruptions? Well, strategic disruptions tend to emerge over time in terms of your awareness of them. And this means that strategic planning steps of various types need to be taken, increasing in depth and detail as you move ahead over time. So, and we can all see exactly how this applied as we looked back to the first of the year at the emergency of the COVID pandemic. Strategic disruptions seem to be lower likelihood, lower uncertain severity of impact, long time horizon. The specifics of the disruption may not even yet be identified. This is when you're in what's called the monitoring phase. You're simply watching for the possibility of any of a range of particular types of disruptions that could impact you. Over time, as you gather more information through monitoring, a particular disruption may increase in to a low to moderate uncertainty. The apparent severity could be higher. You could be closer to a medium-term horizon. You could begin to identify more specifically what that potential threat is. That's the part where assessment and active planning needs to begin to start, particularly with scenario planning taking place as a part of it. This is where leading-edge companies were certainly by February. Governments were, or at least should have been in this position as early as January, December, even November, who are actively monitoring it. But certainly most businesses by February should have been in the assessment and active planning process. As things continue to evolve, we see moderate to higher likelihood, higher severity, short to medium term horizon, with a better definition of the specific disruption. At this point, you're beginning to make more detailed operational planning, and eventually you get to the point where it's clear that it's high likelihood, it's going to happen near term, it's well defined, and we need to actually be moving into implementation planning and execution. Now, in order to take a broad look at this as effectively as possible, you need to have a look at the enterprise risk-adjusted impact of various potential strategic disruptions. This means looking at both the likelihood of a disruption as it is perceived at any point in time and the potential severity of a disruption. Now, clearly, those things that are of low likelihood, and even if they do happen, are going to be of low severity, are obviously low priorities to address. Conversely, those things that are high likelihood and high severity, certainly where we were by late spring with the COVID pandemic, obviously take very high priority. That's obvious. But a lot of companies make the mistake of focusing on the wrong other areas, which is they often misdirect their focus on those things that are highly likely to happen, even though the severity is going to be low. Gosh, we might have a competitor enter our market and start pricing lower than we are to try to gain market share. How are we going to deal with that? Well, it's not that you should ignore the possibility of competitors entering your market, but it's an ongoing part of businesses that competitors always are going to be trying to enter markets, and you should have some routine near-term operational anticipation of those kinds of options. What gets way too little attention, unfortunately, in too many businesses is the possibility of the low likelihood but high severity disruption taking place, like COVID, like climate change, like disruption of supply chains by unanticipated tariffs suddenly being applied by short-sighted governmental operations. The end result is that people need to be thinking much more about the monitoring of those things that, if they do happen, would have a huge impact on your business. In the case of pandemic monitoring on an ongoing basis over time, having a pandemic is a low likelihood, but obviously, as we can see, very high impact. Climate change, very high likelihood. It's going to happen. It is happening. But the impacts will be varied tremendously depending on what industry you are, your geographic location, the nature of your operations, and so forth. Geopolitical disruptions is even a little harder to predict. You're going to have varied likelihoods for various types of disruptions in various areas, various industries, and the impacts will be varied. So you have to think about those things. And the impact of emerging technologies is actually somewhat analogous to climate change. It's going to have a high likelihood, but the impacts will be varied, again, depending on which technologies we're talking about, what industry we're talking about, and so forth. But all of these things are things that businesses should be investing some time and effort in monitoring. And you might say, well, who can afford to set aside the time and effort for monitoring all of these things? Well, the time and effort necessary to monitor all these things well and effectively is a tiny fraction of what it costs most businesses to respond unprepared to the impact of the pandemic when it hits us. It has to be part of your planning, financial planning process. Now, if you do a risk-adjusted impact for monitoring, prior to the first of this year, most businesses would have said, hey, emerging technologies, they're a medium to high risk of impacting us with a low to moderate or fairly high, again, depending on the technology, the industry, and so forth, impact on us. A pandemic, well, it could happen. It's pretty low risk, though. But yeah, if it does happen, it could be pretty severe in terms of its impact. In fact, looking at COVID-19 scenarios, one way to do scenario planning would be to say, well, we could have a low economic impact scenario. Or we could have one that has an economic slowdown. Or we could have what we actually saw in the first half of this year, the second and third quarters of this year, shutdown and recession scenario. And what we actually did see over time, looking at various different types of scenarios, as we moved from, say, early February to mid to late May, was we realized that neither the low economic impact scenario or the just slight economic slowdown scenario were going to be very likely, and that the shutdown and short-term, at least, recession scenario was greatly increasing in likelihood. Now, again, this is something that would have varied significantly from company to company, from industry to industry. But this is what you need to be looking at, thinking about, planning for as you're monitoring for disruptive technology, disruptive impacts, strategic disruptions on your business. So for example, here are the three scenarios in a coronavirus pandemic. And with each of these scenarios, you could look at a variety of things. Clearly, if you're going to address a pandemic effectively, you have to think about things like what's going to be the impact on our supply chain, on the health and safety of our employees, the economic impact on our employees, customer safety, impact on our revenues, impact on maintaining business continuity, and are there opportunities for us that will emerge as a result of this that we should be taking advantage of. And again, achieving each of those is going to require different plans, and the right plan might be different under different scenarios. So you have things like adjusting your current operational plans or temporarily shutting down your operations, changing operations for better safety, changing your employee policies, and that could help with both employee safety and employee economic impact. Customer safety, you want to change your operations, temporarily shut them down, but you might also pursue new opportunities to help your customers be more safe. Revenue impacts, changing your operational impact, temporarily shutting down might be necessary or appropriate, but you could also pursue new market opportunities. Business continuity, you might need to shut down to preserve the business for the long term. You might even need to restructure your business. And the same thing for new opportunities might require you to restructure your business, certainly pursuing new market opportunities. Now, I'm not saying these are the only goals and plans any organization can have, or these are the only scenarios that you should evaluate. I'm simply illustrating examples of how you could approach the evaluation of current and potential strategic disruptions like the COVID-19 pandemic that we've been going through now for the last 3 quarters. And keep in mind, climate change is going to affect us too. You're going to need to have a climate change. What are the impacts going to be? How are you going to mitigate those impacts? And is it going to create any new opportunities for you? And the impacts are going to vary. They might come in by geographical region if you're an international company, even by function. How do they affect our operations, our health, our human resources, our finances? By effect, are we going to be impacted more by rising sea levels or by the increase in temperatures and how that might affect, for example, agriculture? Are we going to be impacted by increases in forest fires? If we're an electrical utility, that's going to have a huge impact on us. Are we going to be impacted by the increase in the number of hurricanes and weather events that we have? And certainly if you are in the transportation or vacation businesses, these are things that you have to think about. So again, this is a way of thinking about how to think about the strategic impact of climate change. Now, in terms of putting together real-world plans, a typical organization will have real-world plans that run 5 to 10 layers deep. So it's not something you do in your spare time in 30 minutes, but realistically, it's something that can be developed, at least initially, within a few days with the right people involved in it and thinking about it carefully. It's also important that you assign variables to balance the relative value of the goals. You may have to achieve a number of goals to execute your overall plan or higher level plans, but some of those goals will be more important than others. And similarly, you're going to have to assign variables to measure the costs of those plans. So you can determine which is the best plan at any point in time for us to be executing to achieve our higher level goals. It's also very important that you think about contingent probabilities. What's the likelihood of a plan succeeding in accomplishing a goal? This is where Bayesian reasoning comes in. Now, I'm not going to get into the mathematics of Bayesian reasoning, but there are tools to help you facilitate that process. And what that means is that you're not simply looking at what's the probability of some particular thing happening. You're looking at, if this does happen, then what's the probability of that happening? And then if that happens, what's the probability of the next thing happening? So you're looking at a series of cascading contingent probabilities. Bayesian reasoning allows you to do this effectively and accurately. There are very good tools in the market for addressing these kinds of things. One of the most critical components is monitoring the situation. To select the plan, you have to monitor the circumstances and be gathering outside information on a regular basis. This is why people use tools like Waze to look at the traffic situation and alternatives. Should we stay on a surface street or stay on the expressway or move to a surface street, for example? This is also why it's important that organizations, businesses, actively monitor for potential strategic disruptions and threats, even if such strategic disruptions are not currently happening at a specific point in time. It's pretty well accepted that in the United States, we did a terrible job of planning for and responding to the impact of the pandemic. But the worst part was not the decisions and communications that took place in the first and second quarter of this year, as bad as many of those were. The worst thing, in my opinion, was what happened 18 months before the pandemic emerged. In spring of 2018, when they had an active pandemic monitoring capability in the White House. It was costing some millions of dollars a year to continuously monitor for potential pandemics and plan for their potential impact. And the decision was made by the White House that we're not having a pandemic. Why are we wasting all this time monitoring? And they shut down those operations. And that's part of the reason why the government was so ill prepared to respond effectively at the time of the pandemic emerging. Now, the same lesson holds true for businesses. You need to be monitoring for those strategic disruptions that are not yet affecting you, because of the distinct possibility that they could, especially those that could have a severe impact on your business. Dynamic transformational planning overall means that businesses can think long-term, setting strategic goals while still having the flexibility to shift dynamically and smoothly in the short and medium term to adapt to both unanticipated and expected strategic contingencies in the form of opportunities, threats, and disruptions of many different types. Implementing dynamic transformational planning is going to be a challenge for any business. It's going to require a way that you need to change how you think about how you manage your business. Incorporating digital transformation technologies like AI, the Internet of Things, 3D printing, and blockchain equally will require you to change the way that you think about managing your business and the way you manage your business processes, your business model, and how you participate in your overall ecosystem. It's going to require a lot of change, starting with the change of mind and moving forward from there. But as the famed historian Henry Steele Commager put so well over a century ago, change does not necessarily assure progress, but progress implacably requires change. Please keep an open mind to making the changes you're going to need to make in your business and as a part of your overall supply chain ecosystem to ensure that your organization is well prepared as possible to leverage the capabilities of these exciting new tools and technologies while being also prepared for the potential strategic disruptions of the various types we've discussed today and others that may emerge in the near future. If I can be of any help to you in that process, it would certainly be my pleasure, and I'm happy to start by taking any questions that we may have. Eliana, do we have any questions so far?
Let me pull up the Q&A. So I have, what is the most common issue individuals experience when implementing blockchain technology?
That actually is a very good question. I think the most common issue individuals experience when implementing blockchain technology is a lack of understanding on the part of the senior management team of their organizations. And it's rarely top executives that are actively getting hands-on, unless it's a very small organization, hands-on involved in the implementation of blockchain technology. It's typically middle-level people who are tracking the technology, think it's got great potential, but they tend to overemphasize the technical design and implementation of the blockchain technology itself, as opposed to getting the support and commitment of the senior management team to help them recognize and understand the business potential of blockchain technology so that they can prioritize it among their overall technology and strategic planning priorities for the company as a whole.
Great. Next question. What are the smart contracts that you mentioned most useful for?
Great. What are smart contracts most useful for? Most of the use of smart contracts that I have seen so far have fallen into a couple of different categories. One that is interesting is in the insurance area, where you have clearly defined insurable losses, and that if that can be clearly measured and identified, then you can have an automated system working with a smart contract to recognize that the insured loss has incurred and paying the insuree for that loss. Let me give you an example of that. There's a blockchain-based tool out there that allows people to take out insurance as to whether or not their airline flights depart on time. They pay $100, for example, and or whatever amount of money. And if their flight takes off on time, then the insurer keeps the money and everything's fine. If the flight is delayed more than 2 hours, then they are paid back 4 times the amount of money that's involved, $400 in the example that I said. And if the flight takes off more than 4 hours delayed, they're paid 10 times the amount of money. So the idea is if they have a serious delay that could be very problematic for them, they could get that. This is all handled on a smart contract on a blockchain that has access to actual flight departure times, so that as soon as the flight takes off, you immediately either know that it was delayed by more than 2 hours or more than 4 hours, or it was not, and a payment is made if appropriate, or the funds are retained if that's the appropriate outcome. Also, we are beginning to see smart contracts implemented in supply chains. It's still very early days at this point. Most of the supply chain information is more tracked around the following up on orders that are placed via other mechanisms, but we're beginning to see some testing on the implementation of smart contracts. And we're going to increasingly see this as people are able to incorporate automated ordering systems into their blockchain-based supply chain initiatives.
Okay, so going back to your airline example, Kristen asked, you mentioned the example of scenario planning for an airline to keep their aircraft running. This is expensive to implement for a small business. Do you have an example of how small businesses can do scenario planning without the heavy investment?
Right. Well, all right. Let me make the distinction between scenario planning. Run through the question one more time, because I thought I heard it. I think I did not hear it quite correctly. Can you run it by me one more time, please?
Sure. So she says that the airline example scenario planning that you gave is expensive to implement for small businesses. So do you have an example of how small businesses can do scenario planning without the heavy investment?
Okay, well, let me try to clarify the way I look at it at any rate. The scenario planning process is thinking about what if certain things happen. So from a small business perspective, it doesn't require a huge investment of time and money to focus planning on what if other key participants, like key customers or second or third tier customers of a supply chain ecosystem that we're part of, want to start engaging in this kind of activity, what might be required on our part and is something we can afford to implement. Now, I will absolutely agree that most small businesses are going to be challenged in implementing the kinds of very sophisticated technology. I talked about integrating Internet of Things technology with artificial intelligence and blockchain all together on their own. In those cases, the small businesses will depend on their technology solution providers to incorporate those capabilities into the solutions that they're offering to them. So whether it's organizations like IDEA or whether it's ERP organizations or others, they need to be planning for the incorporation of these emerging technologies into the solutions they're delivering into the market. And larger organizations who want to be driving change in their overall ecosystem, like the airlines in that case, or a Walmart, or a consortium of electrical manufacturers or distributors, will want to be planning for allowing the time for the technology solution providers to incorporate those capabilities, and that the business case is there. Ultimately, the customers, large and small, need to be putting pressure on the technology solution providers to provide those capabilities that are going to provide economic value to the ecosystem as a whole. This is part of the reason why this is often best done at the ecosystem level, where trade association groups, for example, can work together to say, hey, how can we make our entire supply chain ecosystem work more efficiently? How can we leverage these technologies? And how soon can these various different leading technology solution providers to our industry or in our field incorporate these capabilities so that the ones that are too small to develop them on their own can take advantage of them and participate with their bigger brethren up and down the supply chain with these technologies. So to kind of summarize that long-winded comment, that Even small businesses should be setting aside some time and effort to do strategic planning, scenario planning, and so forth. But a part of that process will be communicating very clearly and effectively with your technology solution providers in terms of their plans and directions for incorporating AI, blockchain, Internet of Things, and so forth into the solutions that they're making available to the markets that they serve.
Great. And Phil Hale asks, can you give an industry or supply chain that is using blockchain? What are they doing with it?
Oh, there's a host. I think one of the best examples I've heard of this, for instance, is in Canada in the retail market. Walmart of Canada has a number of distribution centers around Canada. And of course, they have hundreds of stores in Canada. They have been working with something like 65 transportation carriers who move product from their distribution centers to their retail stores. Now, one of the challenges with, as your member manufacturers and distributors know very well, in dealing with transportation in general, transportation invoices are very problematic. Some 70% of transportation invoices end up being disputed because of disagreements on a host of different areas. What was picked up and delivered, and how was it carried, and how much wait time did trucks have prior to pickup or prior to delivery on arriving at the location. There's a host of reasons why transportation invoices can be incorrect. So what they did was they worked with a number of technology companies and with these transportation carriers, third-party transportation carriers, to incorporate a solution, and I won't get into all the details of how it works, but it incorporates both Internet of Things and blockchain technology so that all of the information is captured in terms of things like wait times and exactly what is being shipped, what's being carried, when the orders were placed, and so forth. And as a result of this, they've been able to reduce the amount of the percentage of their transportation invoices that have disputes, which require human intervention, which costs a lot of money and delay cash flow and so forth, from approximately 70%, like most of the rest of the world, to less than 2%. It's saving Walmart tens of millions of dollars a year, but it's collectively also saving those transportation carriers tens of millions of dollars a year. And as a result of this, Walmart is able to pay its transportation carriers much more quickly, and therefore the transportation carriers are also willing to offer Walmart lower prices because they're now able to get paid faster than they were before. So to me, that's one of the best examples I've seen of incorporating blockchain, and in this case also IoT technologies, into a supply chain to have some very, very clear and definitive benefits. But I could go on. There are many other industries. The electronics industry, for example, as I referenced briefly, in terms of tracking, doing responsible sourcing, making sure they're buying products, or that their suppliers or their suppliers are buying products that come from secure and reliable sources. The supply chain of diamonds from the mines all the way to end diamond retailers is now being carefully monitored with blockchain, which not only is reducing costs of product moving through supply chain, but eliminates people worrying about so-called blood diamonds getting into the supply chain, and making sure the original miners, whether it's of diamonds or whether it's of electronics, of rare earth minerals, for example, are using sustainable methods and legitimate methods in doing business. So we're just seeing an explosion across industries in the use of blockchain and related technologies in enhancing supply chain management. It's very exciting.
Great. So we'll do one more. We have, of all the technologies, is blockchain the one that is being adopted later than AI or IoT?
Well, it varies somewhat from industry to industry. I think I would say that actually IoT is probably moving a little bit more quickly than blockchain, primarily because you do have to have some degree of agreement across various entities in a given business ecosystem to incorporate IoT, but a lot of the benefits can be derived by implementing it within the four walls of a given business or overall enterprise. AI has been around for 30 years in various forms. It's been slowly getting more and more sophisticated and more capable, and it's ramping up exponentially, but at a slowly increasing rate. And we're going to see continued enhancements to AI taking place really indefinitely. I mean, for the next 50 years, AI will continue to just get better and smarter and more effective in working. Blockchain has been around for a decade now, but it's just in the last 2 or 3 years that we've seen businesses start to more rapidly adopt blockchain. We will see most businesses within the next decade, by the end of the 2020s, most businesses will have blockchain incorporated pretty well into their business. That doesn't mean they won't continue to expand the use of blockchain, that the capabilities will not continue to get better and stronger. But just as most businesses now over the last 15 years have incorporated internet and the World Wide Web into their business, that doesn't mean they're not doing a better job of it. It means doing business on the internet, doing e-commerce, is no longer something new and exciting. It's just something you do as a regular part of your business, and you just keep getting better at it. Within the next 10 to 15 years, blockchain will have gotten to that point also. Whereas AI is just going to continue to get better, smarter, more sophisticated over time. Within 15 or 20 years, I would say almost all businesses will be using AI, but the forms of AI, the degree of sophistication of AI is greater. So I don't know if I actually can say sort of which one is in the lead. They're being adopted at varying rates of speed, and they're impacting businesses in varying ways. They're all technologies that electrical manufacturers and distributors, all businesses really, need to be continuing to monitor and think about how they're going to take advantage of as they move on into the future.
Perfect. So that's going to wrap up our questions. Thank you so much, Jack.
It's been a pleasure.